All right, yeah. Glad that you guys could join us for the webinar, that you found the place to be. And this afternoon, I want to talk with you about what I call the grassroots work of movement, which is about tight-knit community, life-forming discipleship, locally rooted presence, and boundary-crossing mission. But let's kind of just have a moment of prayer, and then before I kind of elaborate on those four things, I want to kind of give a bigger framework for our conversation. So let's pray. Father, thank you for this time. Thank you for even though technology, we have some difficulties, Lord, that you can still use it to be a blessing. I pray that this afternoon, Lord, that you would just allow us to have some meaningful interaction on what it means to see the church and to live into the church as movement. And we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. So anyway, Dan and I's most recent book, The Church as Movement, we talk about the need to see the church through a new set of lenses. In a lot of ways, in the Euro-tribal America, the dominant lens that has ruled the imaginations of far too many people is what we call the church as religious industrial complex, which is a resource-driven form of church that has a gravitational pull that unintentionally turns spirituality into a product, church growth into a race, leadership into a business, and attendees into consumers. But when you look at the history of the church and even the church today, it seems that the brightest spurts of genuine growth happens in time of persecution, weakness, and suffering. In other words, genuine growth seems to come from vulnerability instead of strength. Roland Allen, theologian and missionary to China and Africa, in his little book called The Spontaneous Expansion of the Church, he talks about how in Madagascar for 25 years, all of the missionaries were driven from the island, and there was a severe persecutions of Christian was instituted. And yet we're told within that 25 years that the followers of Christ had multiplied tenfold. Alan Hirsch, in his book, The Forgotten Ways, which if you haven't had the chance to see his updated version with a lot of new stuff, you should check it out. But he writes about the time where Mao Zedong took power in China in 1949 and instigating a purging of religion from society. And the church at that time was built by kind of Western forms of church, or in a lot of ways this religious industrial complex was estimated to be at about 2 million people. Now, as a part of this systematic persecution, Mao banished all foreign missionaries and ministers. He nationalized all church property, killed all senior leaders, either killed or imprisoned secondary and third level leaders, banned all public meetings of Christians with the threat of death or torture. And then he proceeded to perpetrate one of the cruelest persecutions of Christians on historical record. As Mao Zedong's reign ended at his death in 1776, and the so-called bamboo curtain was opened in the early 1980s, the question is like, what would the church be like? Would it be completely decimated? No, in fact, they found a thriving church with an estimated, instead of 2 million followers, an estimated 60 to 80 million Christians. And they did this with none of the resources that we think are necessary for movement to take place. They had no professional clergy, no official leadership structures, no central organization, no mass meetings, and yet they grew like mad. When Hirsch tells this story of the Chinese church, he always mentions that the Chinese church believed that every believer is a church planter and every church is a church planting church. In other words, the seed has the potential of becoming a tree, and the tree, the potential of becoming a forest. And so the early church with little resources under persecution obviously also flourished. And again, where is most of the church flourishing today? Most would say in East Asia, Africa, China, parts of Latin America, all places that we might consider under-resourced. And so when we look at these examples, we're reminded that our triune God is building his church and the gates of hell will not prevail. And when we kind of try to take charge and manufacture growth, numerical growth might occur, but not genuine growth. And some of the church growth movement understand, and some of the even church planting movements understanding is kind of like, if I just find these 10 key secrets that will guarantee movement. And that's really not what we mean when we talk about movement. Being movement is recovering a way of being the church of God in the way of Christ and in the power of the Spirit, and allowing God to bless us in whatever way he sees fit. And so God is on mission. We know that because at the center of the universe is a missionary God, and it's our job to join him. And so our focus is really to be faithful, trusting him for fruitfulness. Now, with that kind of basic setup, let me put one more frame in place. Most who study social and spiritual movements with the hope of seeing the gospel go to the ends of the earth agree that the key to cultivating a church planting movement is discipleship. And obviously, this makes sense. It's the clear mandate that's found in the Great Commission that Jesus gave his disciples, and that's been passed down to us. I like the way Eugene Peterson paraphrased it in the Message. He says, Jesus said, God authorized and commanded me to commission you. Go and make disciples far and near in this way of life, submerging them in Trinitarian presence. Then instruct them in the practice of all I have commanded you. And I will be with you as you do this day after day after day, right up to the end of the age. Now, I think too often we fail to understand the genius of how Jesus approached discipleship and how his approach cultivated a movement in the first century that turned the world upside down. Now, sociologists tell us that there are 4 social groups, places to belong that we need as humans to flourish. There's intimate space, personal space, social space, and public space. Intimate space involves 2 to 4 close friends with whom we're most vulnerable. Personal space is that 5 to 12 people whom we grow with. Social space is what the New Testament calls oikos, and that's the 20 to 50 folks that we do life together with. And then public space involves 70 or more people in the neighborhood in a public space. And these 4 spaces are the ways that we belong to each other. Now, what sociologists discovered in the 60s, Jesus lived into in his time. He confided in the 3, he trained the 12, he mobilized the 70, and he spoke riddles or parables, if you will, to the crowds. But at the heart of movement, and really where Jesus dedicated and devoted his time, was in making disciples. And Jesus shows us that discipleship took place in personal space, that those 12 people that he was helping to live into God and build communities on mission. Most churches today that, again, with this religious industrial complex imagination, have a public space and usually small groups, which is personal space. The problem with this kind of imagination is that each of these spaces can do some things really well and other things not so well, right? In intimate space, that's the best place to be most vulnerable with people. Personal space is the best to train and have accountability as we train other people, and really kind of be able to really see if people are capturing the ideas. Social space is best for community and to be on mission, and public space is ideal for inspiration. And so the typical church has a large gathering, and small groups. The problem is that the needs that need to be met in social space and intimate space get piled up on the back of that personal space or the small group, and it really can't do any of those things very well. The typical small group today would be open, which is nice, but the problem is that when if that's an open space, usually the new person, if the group is hospitable, you're going to be kind of cater to the group, to the new person, and thus that group doesn't get the chance to grow deeply and mature. So Jesus used personal space. That's his small group was really by invite only. it was a closed set, if you will, within a bounded set within a centered set. And so for Jesus, the training happened with the 12 in a closed environment, and yet what he instructed there, he lived out in these larger environments, in particular that social space of the 70s. So this wasn't an isolated group. It was just a closed group within a more centered set or more open group. Social space is really the prime space to grow and multiply because it's best for community formation and mission. And so while instruction takes place in personal space, people learn by imitation as we build a social space together. So if discipleship only involves instruction, it really circuits discipleship because most people learn by what we do, not what we say. And so discipleship needs to take place in a small enough space that we can lead by example. So if the church is going to live into movement in the West, we really need to recapture Jesus' understanding of the grassroots work and movement. Public space is great for inspiration, but it's not the place that we bare our soul or engage in incarnational discipleship or live on everyday mission. If we want to help the church grow in movement intelligence, we really need to use public space to encourage people to get involved in what is really the grassroots work of movement, which is tight-knit community, life-forming discipleship, locally rooted presence, and boundary-crossing mission. And this takes place in intimate, personal, and social space. And so that's kind of what we're talking about. I want to talk a little bit about these four things. Tight-knit community, we'll talk about that first. But really, if you think about what is the church, if you had to define the church in her essence and function, and you only had 3 words to define the church, what 3 words would you use? For us, the 3 words that come to our mind is communion, our relationship with God, community, the people of God, and commission, which involves the larger mission, and obviously discipleship is the key to the commission. But it's kind of living out that larger mission of seeing God bring more of heaven to earth and for people to come to Christ. But community is a key part of what the church is, and often it's not something that a lot of people find in today's church. But I like what Larry Crabb says. He says the future of the church depends on whether it develops true community. We can get by for a while on size, skilled communication, and programs to meet every need, but unless we sense that we belong to each other with masks off, the vibrant church of today will become the powerless church of tomorrow. Irrelevant, a place of pretense where sufferers suffer alone, where pressure generates conformity rather than the Spirit creating life. That's where the church is headed, unless it focuses on community. And I would propose that when you look at these 4 spaces of belonging, that social space at 20 to 50, that's where we experience real community. That's where people who are non-Christians can kind of come and be a part of. That's the space that best accomplishes a sense of mission in the neighborhood. Oftentimes, the small group mentality doesn't have that same level of ability to do those things. Randy Frazee puts it this way. He says, the development of meaningful relationships where every member carries a significant sense of belonging is central to what it means to be the church. And again, community is so central to what it means to be the church. And if we don't have a structure that really prizes community, then I think we're going to fail to live out and be the type of movement that God is looking for. I find it fascinating that when we look at the story of God, that it begins with a picnic and ends with a feast. And at the climax of the story, Jesus, the most used piece of furniture in Jesus' life was the table, because it's a place where we come when we're hungry and thirsty. It's a place where we experience laughter and tears, where we share stories, surprises, and secrets. It's a place where families are formed and communities are deepened. It's a place where there's an opportunity for honest conversation, where words that are shared shape who we are and who we're becoming. And it's interesting when you look at the life of Jesus, Jesus taught at the table. He trained his disciples at the table. Jesus extended the table to those whom religious leaders and society had dismissed and damned, like the tax collectors and the sinners. Jesus turned over the table of the religious industrial complex of his day. And so the table was a central place where Jesus did ministry. It was more central than the pulpit. And yet we have lost what it means to be at the table. And David Fitch, in his upcoming book that I think comes out this month, called Faithful Presence, he does a beautiful thing because he takes 7 practices of Jesus, and he talks about them in these 3 circles. There's the close circle, which is kind of like a solid line. There's the dotted circle, dotted line, and then there's the half circle. And the idea is that oftentimes when we think about, say, communion table, we think about the close, not closed, but close circle. Those who we go to the table with those who have faith in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, who remember his death and remember his coming, and that's a central part and practice of the church. But what we do here, and discerning the presence of God at the table, we then practice it in the neighborhood, at our house, where we invite strangers and other people to become part of the table fellowship. And then not only that, but we go into the half circle, the places where we live our life with the people that we work with, and we join them at the table, which is more of a half circle, where we can, again, bring the presence of God to that place. And when you look at Jesus, the way he uses the table, he uses it to extend himself to those who who weren't walking with God. In fact, you could say that he went to the cross because of his table manners and who he ate with. And so we have 21 different opportunities, if you happen to eat 3 meals a day, to be at the table with people and to build a sense of community. So tight-knit community is one thing. The table is a very practical way to live into that. Then there's life-forming discipleship. And so I don't know if you've asked yourself, but why are we not seeing movement in what Alan Roxborough calls the Euro-tribal West? Because I think we are seeing some movement in some parts of the U.S., and particularly with different people groups, different language groups. But Dallas Willard, who passed not too long ago, he says the reason why we're not seeing movement is we just have simply failed to make disciples of Jesus. And so every church really needs to ask themselves 2 questions, he said. Number 1, what's our plan for making disciples? And then number 2, is our plan working? And these are important questions. And so for us, as we've been looking at and training planters around the country, really, I think modeling Jesus and making disciples in that personal space with those 6 to 12 people, and what you instruct there as you build together a missional community, a village, that mid-sized group, that 20 to 50. And so what you learn instruction, but also learn by imitation. And then that group has a mission to a particular neighborhood or network. And so we don't learn just by instruction. That's a big fallacy of Western education. We learn oftentimes by doing. We learn by doing with somebody who knows how to do it, by imitation and immersion. And so these 3 things are very necessary. And that's why discipleship has to be intricately connected to building this community that learns to live in God and be on mission. That discipleship core is where training happens, and then we live it out together, and by building this social space that is seeking to bring a blessing to the local community. And so discipleship happens by instruction, by imitation, and by immersion. And I would say that imitation and immersion is when we do those, that's when we have kind of closed the learning loop. So life-forming discipleship is important. It can't be discipleship just meaning this abstract idea of knowing God and growing. It has to be linked to the core essence of what the church is. And that is we learn to live in God together, be a community of people who are on mission. That's the core. If discipleship doesn't help us do that, it's not the type of discipleship that Jesus came to bring. And so, and that he modeled for us. So there's tight-knit community, life-forming discipleship. The third part of the grassroots work of movement, the core element of what it means to live as a movement, is a locally rooted presence. It's, both culture and theology is cool because it's reviving a stronger theology of place. And the language of place recovers a lost imagination, one obscured by the legacy of modernism, where we traded place for space, the concrete for the abstract. And so recovering a theology of place helps us to recover an ability to enter into the texture, colors, rhythms, and places that we actually dwell, the places that God has set us. In the message, we're told in John 1:14 that the Word became flesh and blood and moved into the neighborhood. And it's interesting that in the incarnation, Jesus left a realm in which time and space had no consequence in order to live in a particular time, a particular place, with a particular people. And so as we seek to join God in the renewal of all things, and we realize that God's put us in a place, a particular neighborhood, the question that I like to ask is, if God's reign were to be more fully realized in this neighborhood, what would be different? And so that missional community, that group of 20 to 50 people, that village, if you will, that's the group that's best to do missions. It's big enough to do mission. And it's every one of these groups need to ask, does God want us to bring a sense of beauty or healing or justice or a combination of things to the neighborhood? Because as we join God and see what he's up to and just examine what's happening in the local concreteness of our neighborhood, as we understand what the problems are, as we understand the passions of our group, then we can identify how we can live out that greater sense of mission. And what you realize in the New Testament, Graham Tomlin in the Provocative Church talks about how the basic way that the church kind of lived out its faith and even engaged in evangelism was always a response to what God was already doing in the community through the people of God. So Peter healed someone. That guy went out and told everybody, and then Peter kind of gave a response to why that healing took place. So as we engage in healing, as we engage in justice, as we engage in bringing a sense of beauty to the places that God has placed us and put us, it's then that people want to know, why are you doing this? And we'll have the opportunity to share about the God whom we're following, to share about the God who's calling us to bring a greater sense of beauty, justice, and healing to the neighborhood. Every church needs to ask, what exactly am I multiplying? Because movement requires reproducibility. This is an important thing. What you are multiplying should be able to be done by just about everyone. If what you seek to reproduce is something that can only be done by paid clergy or celebrity speakers, it will stunt genuine movement. So discipleship in personal space, where lessons are passed on to others, and then the laboratory is a social space where the leaders lead others into what it means to live as a community on mission. The discipleship core develops like a core rule and rhythm of life, and again, that lives into everyday life. But the goal of that discipleship core is to multiply these social spaces, these missional communities. And it's something that's very reproducible. In fact, let's just kind of take religious industrial complex versus churches movement. Typically, the religious industrial complex values, how many people come to the big gatherings, to the rallies, if you will. And so let's just say that this group does it well, and there's 1,000 people added every year to the gathering. All right. So every year, 1,000 people. Let's just say that the church's movement focuses and devotes on discipleship and building these mid-sized group, these missional communities together. And let's just say that let's say every year and a half, this adds 1,000. Every year and a half, this multiplies another missional community. So after 3 years, you'd have 3,000 people at this gathering. And with the missional communities, you've multiplied 2, so you might have 100 people. And so it seems very, very minuscule, right? Like 3 years, all you have is 100 people. Here, there's 3,000. But what's happening here is discipleship, people who are living into their place and bringing a sense of beauty. There's probably some good things happening here as well, but there's real discipleship taking place here. After 6 years, you have 6,000 people here, I guess, and then or close to that. Here you'd have eight missional communities. After 9 years, you'd have 32 missional communities. But when you get to about 15 years, when you focus on multiplication of disciples and multiplying mid-sized group, you'd have 512 missional communities. So multiply 512 times 50, and that's how many people you have. And when you kind of follow this model, even if it's just 1,000 a year, you'd have 15,000. It doesn't even begin to match the numbers, but not only that, but the quality of people that have been developed through discipleship as opposed to just attending a gathering. And so there's a lot of, when it comes to, you could say that more or less is more, slow is fast, and multiplication wins all the time. Something Caesar Kalinowski mentions. So we have tight-knit community as part of the Grassroots Worker Movement, life-shaping discipleship, locally rooted presence, and then finally there's boundary crossing mission. When we talk about in the church's movement, we talk about how it's not only important to be for a city or for a neighborhood, but we need to be with the neighborhood, and then not only that, but we need to move to become of the neighborhood and in the neighborhood or in a network of people. Alex Absalom talks about this kind of 4-piece movement, and it's really what it means to be incarnational. When Paul said, I became a Jew to the Jew, a Greek to the Greek, to win them to Christ, he understood what it meant to kind of be a part of a community, not just be for, but be with, of, and in. There's a church in NoHo, North Hollywood, in the area, the artistic area. Jared and Mary Beth, they're doing a beautiful work there, and they really kind of live into this for, with, of, and in concept. They moved into their neighborhood in North Hollywood. They would often walk around the neighborhood with their dog and pray and meet people, and then they would invite them over for dinner, again using the table for ministry, and they would find what a lot of people call the person of peace, the person who's receptive to the gospel, that has a reputation, good or bad, in the neighborhood, and they tend to be someone who refers you to other people. And so they would meet. They met a person of peace within a music, where a lot of people went to the same music school, and they also met a Muslim. And so they had these two web of relationships that they were connected to through these people. But it took them about 8 months before they were invited into that web of relationships. They would invite people to some of the things that they were doing, but 8 months they finally were invited to kind of live into those communities, and they're starting to see a number of people become Christians. And this really only happens incarnationally. It's not asking people to come to our turf, to come to our service, to come to our events. Incarnation happens like when Jesus, he left heaven and he came on earth and he moved into a neighborhood. Missional means we go out. Incarnational means we go deep. And that means that we learn to kind of become a part of another group and figure out what does the good news look like, and how do we express the good news through this whole web of people who would never step foot in a church. And that's really what it's about. It's about helping to see the renewal of all things, which includes human beings being reconnected to God. It includes us being connected to each other. Everything that was lost at the fall, our relationship with God, with each other, our own brokenness, and our relationship with creation is brought together in Christ. And through the life, death, and resurrection, he inaugurated the kingdom of God. And now we're called to be the people who pray that his kingdom would come and his will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And movement is about that commission. It's about making disciples in that personal space and then multiplying these social spaces, the missional communities and villages, multiplying them across neighborhoods and networks in our city. That's where you see movement take place. So I think I've talked enough. Chris, if we can kind of move over to some questions that people might have. Are you there? So yeah, if you have any questions, it'd be great to dialogue on that now. I can't hear you, Chris, but I see your lips moving. Hello? All right, so I think there's a comment section, a chat section, and feel free to throw up questions here. All right, I don't know if you guys can hear me, but Chris is probably trying to make things work. Again, yeah, we apologize. We use this webinar jam, and today it was not functioning. I guess YouTube has changed a few things, so we're doing our best to kind of make this work. I can't hear you yet, Chris. So maybe you can write out what anybody needs to do so we can get questions, or does chat work, or what? Okay. Go ahead and tweet your questions to V3-movement. Is that yeah, on Twitter. So if you go to Twitter, just tweet your question at V3_movement. At V3_movement. And then we'll pick them up there. Chris will translate it for me. So at V3_movement. I can write that. I think I don't know if people see that, but. All right. Any questions yet, Chris? Okay. Can you give some descriptions of what a church has done in each of these 4 spaces? Yeah. All right. So again, I think the primary thing that we build movement on is first that personal space, which is where discipleship happens. And what happens in that space, it really should be like a 6 to 8 month training on what it means to be a disciple. In essence, what does it mean to live into God and build these communities on mission? The whole point of that discipleship is learning to live in God, build communities on mission, that social space together. And so there needs to be instructions. In a lot of ways, we have a lot of churches using the church's movement as the primary training material. And because we go through 8 different competencies that we think are important to kind of have a sense of movement. So they're under 4 different areas: distribution, discipling, designing, and doing. And so under distribution, there's two things that are worked through. One is movement intelligence, and that we just need to understand and view the church through that lens of movement, but we go into more concrete ways to look at that. And then polycentric leadership, as opposed to hierarchical or flat leadership. We talk about shared leadership. The second thing as it relates to discipleship is simply, what does it mean to be a disciple? and what does it mean to make disciples. Those are core competencies that we need to know if we're going to see the church's movement. So this is happening. This is a training I'm describing now that happens in personal space, that what we call the discipleship core, that 8 to 12 people that we're training, that closed space by invite only. The other design, we talk about missional theology, and then we talk about being an ecclesial architect, an architect of the church. And so we talk about those 4 spaces there. We talk about a rule and rhythm of life, which I'll mention in a minute there. And then finally, we have community formation and incarnational practices. And so what happens for a lot of the people and a lot of church planners that we're training, they take the discipleship core and they help these disciples kind of learn these 8 competencies, first by instruction, and then by imitation as they build a community on mission, and then through immersion by living into that together. So that's kind of personal space. When you have people who are part of that discipleship core, that's really a group of people who make a covenant together to live into their own rule and rhythm of life. And so when I talk about a rule and rhythm of life, a rule is a spiritual habit that you engage in, and the rhythm is how often you engage in it. Could be daily, could be weekly, monthly, annually. And we encourage people to develop a spiritual habit, spiritual practice around the 3, around communion, our life with God, around community, what we're building together, and around commission, making disciples that are on mission together. And so usually the communion part, it could be a practice of just studying the scriptures daily. It could be Lectio Divina, a group way that we do scriptures, whatever is that help us connect with God. And I think that's going to be something that changes and develops. Community for us is usually involves the rule and rhythm of connecting with the intimate space, that 2 to 4 people. And what we encourage people to do in that space isn't something that's very complicated. It's really kind of coming together, and it's a mutual discipleship group where we simply ask, how are things going in us, like with our relationship with God? How are things going around us with our relationship with community? And how are things going? How is God working through us as it relates to living on mission? Those are the 3 things that are talked about in that intimate space. And so that describes 3 spaces. You have your discipleship core, personal space. Part of their rule and rhythm is living into this intimate space, and they're together building the social space. And the social space, again, it's important that these groups have a mission, and they think, so when I was in Hollywood, as we were kind of building our missional community, we had to discern what is it that the neighborhood needs. And so an example, one of the things that we did besides daily helping to feed some of the needy in the neighborhood with those who were needy, we realized that there was a lot of musicians in LA who, if you're a musician in LA, oftentimes when you get invited to play at a bar or some space, if you don't bring enough people, you actually have to pay the bar to play there. And so we created a thing we were called Artists at the Fountain, and we would host different bands. We would charge maybe like $10-15. All of that money went for either some local or global justice issues. And then we were able to kind of give this band a new audience, a new group of people to play with, and we often were able to give them some type of gift in the process. And that would be, so we're kind of building a sense of beauty in the neighborhood, but we would also be involved in the daily feeding of people, and that was a justice piece. And that would be kind of one example of a missional community living in the mission. And as they did this, we were able to kind of share our faith with other people. Those are those 3 spaces. I think the the weekly gathering, that public space, I do think like we need to give some fresh imagination to that. I feel that that too often it's creates consumers, and so there's really three ways that we have found that you can change up that space, and that's either by the frequency. Maybe you don't. There's some places in the country, like my friend Dan, their church only meets once a month in that public space, and the rest of the time is in more of that social space and the other three spaces. So frequency can kind of disrupt kind of this consumeristic mentality. But the other ways that can be done is through the form. In other words, even the way that the room is laid out. If you go to a church that kind of has a theater style room and a stage, sometimes just the way that's laid out kind of creates a certain expectation from people coming. I remember the first time I went to Life on the Vine, which is a church that David Fitch started in Chicago. And maybe there's a group of about 250 people that met, but they met in the round. And the interesting, there was like an aisle that went north to south and east to west. And typically there's different churches that meet in the round, but usually when a church meets around, oftentimes the speaker you will find in the center, right? Because they can make good eye contact. But when I went into this space, the speaker didn't speak from the center. What was at the center was the table, was the bread and the wine. And when the speaker spoke, they spoke from kind of the west end, the edge of that group. And so the form, the very nature of kind of coming into this setting said a lot to me without any words being spoken. I realized that Jesus was the center of this community, that when the person spoke from the edge of the circle, I kind of took that to mean like, hey, that they were bringing the word of God, but they were bringing it as a fellow priest and as a part of the people. And there's a lot of things that just the formation of the group can change the way that space looks. And then the function of the space. I think, I remember visiting my recent trip to San Francisco. I was visiting Mark Scandrette, and I got a text as soon as I got off the plane, hey, you got to come meet me at this protest rally, because there had been some police brutality, especially among the brown and blacks in the particular neighborhood. And so there was this rally of people that I feel like there was definitely parts of the church there, but it was only the black and brown parts of the church. Not much of the white church was represented in that time. But that's another public space that we can kind of be in, that's very public. It's not just kind of our little thing that we're doing. And so I think there's a lot that can be reimagined in what public space looks like. But hopefully that gives you a little bit more detail of the four spaces. And we go in a lot of detail in the Churches Movement book, which, by the way, if you go to churchesmovement.com, you can get the book at a really big discount. So try to check that out if you do. I think Chris will probably send the email with that. Do we have any other questions, Chris? We have about 10 more minutes. Maybe we can take another question or two. Okay. Yeah, so how does this relate to church planting? Well, I think in a lot of ways, if you're, every church again has to ask itself, what are we multiplying? Dana and I kind of make the case that we should be multiplying these missional communities or villages, this mid-sized groups of 20 to 50, which has at the center a discipleship core, right, of 8 to 12 people. And that's the simplest thing to multiply. Planting a church is simply multiplying that a few times. When you have 4 or 5 missional communities, you have a congregation. And I think it makes sense to have some type of public gathering practice. But the whole point of the large gathering is really to get people involved in the grassroots work of movement. So take your favorite politician today, and most of us don't have a favorite these days, but like, there's all these political rallies, these public gatherings that they have all around the US, right? Jesus, in a sense, had these public gatherings all around Israel. His platform was much better than anybody's current platform. It was the Sermon on the Mount. And so he went around, talking about that. But the whole point of that public gathering was to get people involved in the grassroots work of movement, confiding the 3, training the 12, mobilizing the 70. That's the grassroots work of the movement. So I think oftentimes the tail wags the dog, and we think that this work is so that this happens. But the whole point of a public gathering is to get people into the real work of movement. But church planting, it's just multiplying these mid-sized groups, multiplying missional communities. As you get 4 or 5, you have a whole church, and then you just continue to multiply those. Advice for helping detox folks in personal space community from industrial complex expectations and reframe the vision. Yeah, that's a great question. We all need a little, yeah. I think, I run into a lot of young people who are already internally and intuitively understand that the church is something more than the religious industrial complex. But when you've been a part of the religious industrial complex for a long time, there are some things about it that if we don't necessarily want to grow and develop, that is kind of a nice thing. Like a lot of people want to go and, it's a place their kids get watched for a few hours, get to hear a great sermon, and then kind of go home and think that we've kind of done our Christian duty. Sometimes when life is busy and all of that can be an attractive mode. But I think if we start to honestly look at it, one of the things we lack in America is really having deep community with each other, doing life together with others on mission. And I think the biggest way to reframe people's imaginations is simply to do it. Like there's nothing that taste, the psalmist says, and know that the Lord is good. It's only when we kind of get into practicing discipleship where we're building these communities on mission and we're seeing life change. We're opening our lives to other people. We're enjoying what it means to be community. And even though it's messy and there's difficulty, there's a joy that happens when you get involved in the concrete work of the neighborhood. The way to reframe it is actually just to do it and to invite people to do it with you. And that's going to be the best thing. It's not, there's no amount of talking that's going to get people to change. They have to kind of actually get involved and immerse themselves in the mission for it to happen well. All right. Yeah, please, if you have questions, you need to tweet it to @V3_movement, @V3_movement. That's where you can put your questions. All right. Justin Wester asks, is movement simply growth? You mentioned it's recovering a way of being the church. Is that through the practices you mentioned? Yeah. No, obviously it's growth, both qualitative and quantitative. Again, the beautiful thing about movement, it's really actually centered on us maturing in Christ. It's about having a greater quality of people. It's I think it's about discipleship. It's about being the people of God who live in the world for the sake of the world in the way of Christ. And so, as I mentioned, it's really not the growth thing. It's kind of what we're growing. Are we kind of growing consumers? Are we growing disciples who know how to live in the Spirit, who have a greater sense of joy and peace and love and faithfulness? That's the goal, is to make disciples. But when we practice making disciples in a movemental way, not only will we grow in a qualitative way, we'll also grow in a quantitative way. So it's not either or, it's both. But it starts with focusing on making disciples of Jesus, being and making disciples, and the quality of our lives. And to be honest, like if we don't have that as the first thing, discipleship, usually disciples are not going to be greater than their teacher. And if we don't have a life worth imitating, then we don't really have anything to invite people to. If we want to be the people of God, we have to have a life that's worth imitating. And so it begins and really ends with making disciples. But as we do that in time, it's usually not the fastest way, but there's also going to be more people added to the kingdom, as we see throughout the book of Acts. All right, so we got time for one more question. Alan Taylor asked, what ways would you suggest for explaining the gospel when people ask what actually it is? Would these be reproducible? Yeah, I think it's one thing that we talk about in the book, in the missional theology chapter. And I think we have to get really good at trying to explain a holistic, what we call a holistic gospel. It's not a gospel just about me and Jesus. The good news is personal, but it's not private. It's personal, it's social, and it's cosmic in nature. And so I think what we have to do is learn to become storytellers again. And we have to actually learn the larger story of God so that we make sure we understand what the gospel really means. And so when we talk about this, and again, I would encourage you kind of to get the book to kind of see some of the details, but it's starting with creation, the fact that God created the world and it was good. And we need to understand the goodness of the world. And then obviously there's the fall. And then the next part of the story is God calls Abraham and creates a nation out of him. So you have Israel. Israel, a huge part of the story of God. I mean, it takes up a lot. The Old Testament takes a lot of the story of God. So we have to be able to explain the whole story of Israel. But what Israel couldn't do, Jesus did, God did by coming in the person of Jesus. And so really to understand Jesus well, what he said and what he was about, we really have to understand the earlier part of the story. Because I think oftentimes we don't understand Jesus properly because we don't have a first century Jewish context for Jesus. And you have to know the Old Testament to understand what even Jesus was doing, the significance of it, and what his words really meant. And let me give you kind of an example of this. I had a friend who was a native Indian who was going to the University of West Virginia. And in his tribe, in this native Indian tribe, when life was going well, they kind of grew their hair long, and that usually meant life was good. They were living in a sense of liberty and freedom. And the only time that they cut their hair was when something, really, really bad would happen. And so what happened in his tribe, the chief of the tribe had died. And so he cut his hair out of, just being really, really deeply sad. And so he goes to school the next day, and some of his friends, oh man, I really love your haircut. And obviously they didn't understand his context, and so they misinterpreted his haircut. They just thought it was, something cool and new thing that he did. But for him, it was a deep sense of loss. And in the same way, too often we don't really understand the good news that Jesus was bringing in its fullness and compact because we don't understand the rest of the story. But in essence, the good news Jesus was bringing was the good news that God is reigning over the world, and he inaugurated this kingdom that we're to pray for becomes a greater reality. And so you have creation, you have the fall, you have Israel, you have Jesus, you have the church, the place that we live now, and you have new creation. And when we think about what God's future is, this new creation, what we see in Revelation 21, where the new Jerusalem comes down out of heaven to earth, what we see in Revelation 21 is the prayers of Jesus answered, where heaven and earth kiss, that God's will that's being done in heaven is now being done on earth. that God comes to be with us, not that we come to be with God, which is more of a Gnostic gospel. And so with this renewed heaven and earth, with this new heavens and new earth, doesn't say that he's going to make all new things, but he's going to make all new things. And as you understand the beginning of the story, the end of the story, and the middle of the story, as we understand that, we really can understand how to share good news. That's not just good news for our souls and forgiveness, but it's good news that God wants to liberate the whole world. He wants to, even new creation in Romans 8 says creation groans to be released, from the curse, and it will be in someday. And so as we see the future that God's painted through the prophets and through John the Revelator, and we start living into that future now, we help people, we proclaim a news that's not just personally good, but it's good for society. In fact, it's a news that involves all of cosmic reality. So I think it's kind of learning these different points of the story, and elaborating it based on the people that we're connecting to, the issues that they're wrestling through, and we relate how this good news story relates to their story and their concerns and their issues. So anyway, we're at about that time. It's 1:03. We'll probably have to end our time today, but if you found this a helpful time, again, I think you'll probably find the church's movement book meaningful. It's something that you can pick up anywhere, but if you want to get some pretty deep discounts, you can go to churchesmovement.com, and there are some really good discounts that our publisher, University Press, is giving if you order through that particular page. But Chris, do you have anything else that we need to know? Nope. Okay. Hey, really glad you guys could join. My friend Dan is doing a webinar next week on discipleship in the neighborhood. You can check that out. There'll be some things at the V3 site. Check your email to get a replay of this. And been great to be with you guys. I pray that God would bless you and allow you to be a blessing to your neighborhood. And don't forget, go and make some disciples, bringing the good news of Jesus to the people around you. Peace out.